Okay, so we are going to talk about chemistry just a little bit today and tomorrow. And we're going to start out just talking about some of the major elements or major atoms in the human body. And of course, the big ones would be carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, which is what makes us an organic creature. But there are also other elements that we're going to discuss that we don't have quite as much in the body. So these types of elements are called trace elements. Now, although they're in very small or trace amounts, they're super duper important to the human body. So we're really going to focus a lot on sodium, potassium, calcium, iron, but the one up there that's Se, this actually stands for selenium. And just to kind of give you an idea how even though they're in small amounts, they're super important, you only need to take about 90 micrograms of selenium in your diet per day. But if you don't have that, then eventually what will happen is your muscles will turn white, then they will turn to mush, and then you will die. So it's probably super important you have some selenium in your diet every day, which of course, as long as you're eating any kind of vegetables, you're getting selenium. And if you're taking any type of multivitamin, they almost always have selenium in it. Also, if you're very low on selenium, your thyroid won't work, and so you'll be very sluggish and tired, even though you only need about 90 micrograms of this stuff a day. So again, even though we call them trace elements, they're really super important in what they do, even in their tiny amounts. So we'll discuss these as we go on. So we're going to also talk about a few other terms. We're going to go back, kind of refresh your memory with atomic number, atomic mass. We'll talk about ions. And then we're also going to discuss isotopes. And we're going to start with atomic mass. This is the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom is equal to the number of neutrons. Do you remember that? So in an atom, in the nucleus, we have protons, which are positively charged. And in most atoms, we also have neutrons, which are neutral. And then circling around the outside in an orbit, we have electrons, which are negatively charged, okay? So when we calculate atomic mass, the number of neutrons in the nucleus is equal to the number of protons. Now, some chemicals, many chemicals, can exist in multiple forms. These multiple forms are called isotopes. So you have, for instance, hydrogen. Hydrogen is real simple. Hydrogen is an atom that has exactly one proton and one electron. It doesn't even have a neutron. However, this is what we would call a hydrogen atom. There are also hydrogen isotopes. And these isotopes, some of them occur in nature, and sometimes we make them in the laboratory. And we can add neutrons to this hydrogen atom, and now instead of it actually being a hydrogen atom, it's what we would call a hydrogen isotope. Now, isotopes are radioactive, and so sometimes you'll hear people refer to them as radioisotopes. So another example is carbon. Carbon has an atomic mass of 12. That means it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. However, we can change carbon so that maybe instead of carbon having 12, carbon will have 14. And so what did we change if this is an isotope? If we call it carbon 14 instead of carbon 12. The number of neutrons. When we change the number of neutrons, we are creating an isotope. So for instance here, this is hydrogen, this is an atom. It has one proton and one electron. For something to be an atom, the number of protons must equal equal the number of electrons. If the protons and electrons don't equal, you can't call this an atom. Now, we can change this atom here, 1 proton, 1 electron, and we're going to add a neutron to this. And now this is what would be called hydrogen 2, or better known as deuterium. This is radioactive hydrogen. If we add 2 neutrons to a hydrogen, now we have hydrogen 3, which is also known as tritium. This is a radioactive hydrogen also. The more neutrons you add, the more radioactive the isotope becomes. Now, there are 3 different types or levels of isotopes, or what we might call radioisotopes, because they're radioactive. They create a type of radiation. So we have an alpha, a beta, and a gamma radioisotope that we're going to talk about, each one a little bit more potent than the next. Now, the reason we're discussing these is because we use these types of things in the medical field. So it's real important for you to know what it's doing to your patient, as well as what it can potentially do to you, and you don't want it to do anything to you. Now, alpha radiation is the weakest type of radiation there is. So if you're using alpha radiation, it's because you don't have to do anything super powerful. Matter of fact, if somebody shot alpha radiation at you and it hit your shirt, let's say, it couldn't penetrate through. It's not strong enough to even go through your shirt. However, if you inhale it or if you ingest it, it can cause problems. For instance, one of the things that you have to know about radioisotopes, atoms that have become radioactive, is that they give off a lot of kinetic energy. They radiate kinetic energy. So if I inhale, okay, or I ingest this radioactive isotope, it will radiate kinetic energy into my body. Now, what that kinetic energy does is it slams into my cells. And when it hits my cells, there is potential to make my cells break. And that can create all kinds of havoc inside somebody's body. Now, if I'm just exposed to a little tiny bit of it, maybe I inhale a little bit, no big deal. But if I live someplace where there's a lot of this type of alpha radiation being emitted into the air, or maybe it's coming down in rain and I'm eating the plants that it's watering, then I can get a lot of it building up in my system, and the more it builds up, the more potential damage it can do to my body. As a matter of fact, sometimes this alpha radiation can also get into my cells without breaking them, but they break the DNA of my cells and cause mutations. And so now I can get cancer from this, or I can have an offspring that has mutations from being exposed to repeated doses of this alpha radiation. But again, it's not really strong. If somebody were like to shoot a beam at me and I hold this towel up, it can't go through. It couldn't go through a piece of paper. If somebody has it on the other side of the door, it wouldn't be able to go through the wall. On the other hand, a little bit stronger type of radiation is called beta radiation. Now let me just tell you one other thing about alpha. We don't really use it in the hospitals. When we talk about radiation, we're talking about beta or gamma radiation. Now beta radiation, again, lots of it in nature. You and I are exposed to it quite often. It really doesn't do a lot of damage because, again, it's not super powerful. It really can't penetrate too far into the body. But if you have repeated exposure, it can cause a lot of problems, okay? And one of the big deals is that beta radiation does a lot of mutation of our DNA. Now, this is really important for you to know because you may work in a department that uses beta radiation, and this is radiation therapy that we use to kill cancer cells. And one of the things that's super important for you is if you're mixing this stuff up or you have to transport it from point A to the patient, this stuff can affect you, okay? It can penetrate through wood. It cannot penetrate through thicker glass, however. So usually it comes in very thick glass vials, okay, so that it can't get out and affect you. When I was working at Loma Linda, I worked with beta radiation a lot. And what you will also do when you work at the hospitals, they'll give you a little tag that you wear. And that tag, when it turns a certain color, like for instance at Loma Linda, it would go from blue to black. As soon as that tag turned any kind of black whatsoever, you have to stop working with the radiation because your exposure has become maximum. Now, I worked with radioactive materials for about 8 years, and what it did is it completely killed my thyroid because every month my tag went black. And that's one of the things that we use beta radiation in the hospitals for, is to kill thyroid cancer. Now, I didn't have cancer. I just worked with so much radioactivity that it was just something that was going to happen over time. The research that I was doing was quite intense, looking at different types of radiation therapy for different types of cancers, and it happens to a lot of researchers that work with this radioactivity. So for me, I take T3 and T4 in a pill form for the rest of my life because I absolutely have no thyroid. Now, your patients may come in and they may have thyroid cancer, for instance. And in the good old days, and I'm going to show you a video and you'll see this, when people started to get thyroid cancer, they used to go in and do a surgery and they would cut the person basically from ear to ear, and you'd have this scar that looked like maybe a serial killer had tried to get to you, and didn't succeed for the rest of your life. So nowadays, instead, they don't do that. They don't remove the thyroid. Instead, you have your patient drink radioactive material. And in this case, it's radioactive iodine, because T3 and T4, part of these hormones are made up of iodine. Remember, I told you one is triiodothyronine. The iodo is an iodine component. So you give your patient radioactive iodine. And the reason we do that is because the thyroid is the only organ in the body that actually uses iodine. So when the patient drinks this, that radioactive iodine moves through the circulation and goes straight to their thyroid. And you give this beta radiation at such a high dose that within just about 30 minutes it completely kills all of the thyroid cells. Now, we give this for thyroid cancer. We also give this for hyperthyroid. Hyperthyroid is when the patient makes too much T3 and T4. What do you think some of the symptoms would be of your patient that makes too much T3 and T4? You would think that they would be very active, and you'd think they'd be very thin, right? Because their metabolism is super high. And because their metabolism is so high, they're just like they got the jitters and they're always moving, and that's actually not true. Your hyperthyroid patient is usually overweight. But the reason being is because they can't sleep. These people sleep maybe 5-10 minutes a night. Their body is too fast, because for you and I, the body slows down at nighttime naturally. Their body, their whole metabolism is still so fast that they can't sleep. And now the next day they're super duper tired. And what do you do when you're super duper tired? You pound the caffeine, you eat the candy, you do whatever it is to, keep yourself up and going so that they can go to work. They're eating constantly. So many, many times your hyperthyroid patient is actually very overweight. But it's because they eat so much food to try to stay awake all day. Because they are still super duper hyper, but it's not that kind of hyper you wish you had, that you'd have so much energy but you'd feel good hyper. It's the hyper where they just feel really bad because they can't sleep. So what we do for these patients is kill their thyroid off so that it allows them to slow down. Now, if we kill their thyroid off, though, they have to take T3 and T4 in a pill form for the rest of their lives. So that's one of the things. They instantaneously become hypothyroid for the rest of their lives. So this is one of the major ways that we use beta radiation in the hospital setting. Gamma radiation. This is the big boy of the radioactive world, okay? This guy is super, super strong. And I'm going to show you gamma waves. So what happens here is we actually have atoms that are exploding. And these atoms are emitting massively high energy waves. Now we can use gamma radiation also in the hospital, a very controlled setting, in what's called a gamma knife. Now, it's not really a knife, it's more like a laser beam that is guided by a computer. And this again is for tumors, but mainly for tumors in the brain. And we need to use this because it's got to go through that thick skull of ours. And so you need radiation that's a little bit more powerful that can actually get through the skull bone. And the really cool thing about this is that this laser beam that they shoot through the skull is really fine and pinpoint, so that they can only hit certain cells or certain areas of the brain and not actually damage other areas. So that's really very nice technique. It's too powerful for other areas of the body though, so we can't use the gamma knife in the other areas. So again, alpha radiation, very weak, can't even penetrate paper. Beta radiation a little bit stronger, but it can't go through like a thick piece of wood or a thick piece of glass. Gamma radiation can go through anything except maybe a really thick piece of lead. Okay, so when you're using gamma radiation in the hospitals, you will be standing behind a lead door or a lead wall so that it doesn't get to you. All right, so I'm going to show you two videos. Now, these videos, okay, I want you to know all about these. These videos were shot in the Ukraine after a nuclear power plant blew up. And when this nuclear power plant blew up, it released hundreds of tons, millions of tons, I should say, hundreds of millions of tons of gamma radiation into the atmosphere. This happened in the 1980s, so maybe before some of you were born. And the gamma radiation went around the world 5 times. So it came all the way to California. Just consider, however, that this nuclear power plant that exploded, only one of its reactors actually exploded because it got too hot. You and I are being exposed to 4 nuclear reactors right now that exploded a couple years ago in Japan. This reactor in the Ukraine was actually quickly contained. They were able to get lead around it, and they were able to stop the spread of the radiation. However, the nuclear reactors in Japan still have no lead around it, and that gamma radiation has spread quite substantially to the state of California since we are closer to Japan. And we are all, on a daily basis, being affected by this. As a matter of fact, the gamma radiation is so bad, if you were to go deep sea fishing, they take a Geiger counter and they scan your fish with this to recommend whether you should or should not eat that fish. So it is affecting us, and a lot of this that's being released is actually radioactive iodine, so that I think in the next few years you're going to see a much higher incidence of thyroid issues in people from California, which means that this radiation is affecting their thyroid right now, and you'll see a lot more hypothyroid than we saw before. I'm not going to show you some of the worst videos. There's some really significant videos coming out of Japan. There is one researcher who, she actually left the state of California and moved to England because she felt the radioactivity was too high for her children. And when I watched that video, I was like, holy crap, maybe I should be moving out of California too. But so it's a severe problem, and it not only affects us in here, but it affects a lot of your patients. So would you mind turning off the lights for me, please? And these are both about 5-minute videos. So this is the city of Chernobyl. And like I said, this happened in the 1980s. This city is still vacant, and nobody can live within 100 miles of this city because it's so radioactive. Every man, woman, child within 100 miles of the city died. Plant, and this is where the explosion occurred. Now, of course, that used to be the worst nuclear disaster. Now notice what these gentlemen are wearing to go into this power plant. This is not something that prevents radiation from getting into them, but they were the first responders, and no one told them how dangerous this was. There were about 1,000 men who came on the scene, and within just a couple of days, they were all dead.
Тому що дуже велика радіація в нашому районі, тому таке здоров'я дуже погане.
I had a student who was in Germany at the time that Chernobyl exploded, and all that stuff they showed you is supposed to represent the radiation spreading across Europe. And one of the things that a lot of people didn't talk about was not only were people dying, the children were most likely getting leukemia And but the animals were affected by this too. And the Russian government at the time was in control of the Ukraine, and they decided they would slaughter the animals and continue to sell them, even though they were full of radioactivity. And they sold the meat at super duper low prices all over Europe. And they sold it to a lot of our military bases. And one of my students, she said, oh, let me just show you this while I'm talking. This is the what they call the lead sarcophagus that they were able to get around where the explosion was. So they were able to build this lead encasing, and now no radioactivity is able to come out of it. But for my student, they bought some of this meat. And when she was taking this class, she came up to me afterwards and she said, you know, I'm really glad you showed these videos because I had no idea about all these problems, because her two children were young at the time and they had been really, really sickly the majority of their life. And she said they could pretty much pinpoint it back to when she bought that bad meat, that radioactive meat. They were not told it was radioactive. And so this radiation is in their body. It doesn't go away. I mean, this radiation has a half-life sometimes of 1,000 years. That means in 1,000 years, half of its potency goes away. And it takes thousands of years for this radiation to totally go away. So for her, nobody could explain to her what the problem was for all of her children. And so we actually got a Geiger counter, and she brought her kids in, and we passed the Geiger counter over them, and they were very radioactive. So you could pick up where that radiation was still in their body. And there's nothing you can do about it. Absolutely nothing. All right, so I have one more video. It's about 3 minutes. And what this gamma radiation is doing to the helicopter, imagine now what it's doing to these men. Oh my God. Told you it was powerful. Many children were born deformed, mentally retarded, all kinds of problems. So it's a completely dead city, like I said, and it won't, thank you, it won't be able to be inhabitable for several hundred years at least. So our biggest problem right now in the world is that there are 4 reactors melting down in Japan, and they're still so hot they can't put the lead around it to contain all of the gamma radiation. And you just don't hear about it anymore. The government did put out a report about a month, maybe 2 months ago, that said that they now are officially confirming that the state of California has high levels of gamma radiation coming from Japan. Only took them a few years to do it, but they have officially confirmed that. So it's just something for you to be aware of that is happening, and unfortunately it's the world that we live in, and there's not much you can do about it. But you want to be aware for your patient's sake and even for your own sake. If you're feeling unreasonably tired, if your hair is falling out, if you're gaining weight for no reason at all, if you have massive cravings for sugar and salt, if you have problems getting pregnant, if you have very dry skin, if you put all of these things together, you probably have a thyroid issue. And so this is something that you have to be aware of, that your patients are going to come in and they're going to complain about various things like this because they're much more susceptible to radiation problems. And just really there's nothing we can do about it. In Japan, I mean, they obviously are having it much worse than us. They literally take their food, and in their grocery stores there are Geiger counters in certain areas of the country where you can scan your food to see if it has, in your opinion, acceptable levels of radiation. And this is quite horrifying. I mean, these poor individuals are having to live with a very, very terrible, terrible situation. But there's nothing anybody in the world can do at this point. And if it gets any hotter, then we could have some really bad problems. Some really serious problems. It has not all exploded yet, which is why, like I told you, that one researcher, she took her family to Europe because she's afraid if it does explode all the way, that a lot of researchers think it could wipe out Hawaii and possibly all of the West Coast. I'm like, whoa, holy crap. So, I don't know. Anyway, but I show this to you just because you need to be aware these types of things exist. Any questions?
Maybe we can transfer